An Italian naturalist named Gianluca Serra drove out into the Syrian desert with a pair of binoculars and a notebook and an almost irrational amount of hope. He was looking for a ghost, a bird that, as far as most scientists were concerned, had already disappeared from the Middle East. A bird that hadn't been reliably spotted in Syria for decades. The locals called it strange-looking, bald, dark, a little bit ugly, honestly. But Serra had a feeling, and somewhere near the ancient ruins of Palmyra, one of the most breathtaking cities in human history, he stopped the car, raised his binoculars, and found it. 7 of them. 7 birds. That was it. That was the entire wild migratory population of the northern bald ibis left on the planet. A species that had once filled the skies of 3 continents, that had nested on cliffs from Morocco to Austria, that ancient Egyptians had considered so sacred they turned it into a hieroglyph, and what was left of it, in the wild, migrating the way it had always migrated, was 7 individuals standing in the Syrian desert. And what happened next, what those birds did, what the people who found them did, and what Italy had to do with all of it, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of conservation. A story about extinction and obsession and ultralight aircraft and a Hollywood movie from 1996. A story about poachers and scientists and a bird so strange-looking that even the people trying to save it will admit, with a laugh, that it is not exactly pretty, but it is alive, barely, and that is everything. Let's go back. The northern bald ibis scientists call it Geronicus eremita. Birders call it the waldrapp. And if you ever see one, you will probably just call it startling is a bird unlike almost anything else in Europe. It's roughly the size of a large crow, jet black with feathers that catch the light and flash iridescent green and purple. It has a long, curved beak, like something out of a fever dream. And its head is completely naked, just bare, wrinkled red skin and a crest of long black feathers sticking out like a punk rocker who gave up halfway through. It is not a bird that blends in. It is not a bird that apologizes for itself. For most of human history, it was everywhere. Fossil records place it across 3 continents, going back nearly 2 million years. It bred on cliff ledges, from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way through the Middle East and up into Central Europe. There were colonies in Austria, in Switzerland, in Germany, in the Alps, in Italy. The birds were part of the landscape in a way that's hard to imagine now, because the next part of this story is very human and very predictable. People ate them. Not all people, not everywhere. But by the 16th century, something had shifted. As European cities grew and farming expanded and the wild spaces shrank, the northern bald ibis started to disappear. And what accelerated that disappearance, what really drove it off a cliff, was that someone, at some point, decided the young birds were a delicacy, fledglings, taken from their nests. There are records from the 1500s of people systematically harvesting ibis chicks. And once that pressure combined with habitat loss and the disruption of their ancient nesting sites, the collapse was fast. Shockingly fast. By 1630, just a few decades, the northern bald ibis was gone from Europe. Not declining, gone. 300 years before conservation was even a concept, this species had already lost an entire continent. What was left retreated to Morocco, to a small population clinging to the Atlantic coast, and to a few pockets in the Middle East. The world forgot about them. For centuries, stories about the crested ibis that medieval Europeans had described were dismissed as fantasy, as confused accounts of some other species. The bird became something between a legend and a footnote. Then, in 2002, Gianluca Serra found those 7 birds in Syria. And the scientific community had a complicated reaction. Because on one hand, this was extraordinary, an undiscovered wild population, a living thread connecting the present to something ancient. On the other hand, 7 birds. In a country that was about to become one of the most dangerous places on Earth, the researchers moved fast. They tagged the birds, tracked them, discovered that these 7 individuals still carried the old migratory tradition, flying south through the Arabian Peninsula all the way to Ethiopia to spend the winter. A 3,000-mile round trip every year. Just 7 birds making a journey that their ancestors had made for millennia. One of the birds was shot in Saudi Arabia in 2009, just like that one bullet, and the population dropped to 6. Sarah tried everything. He pushed for protection agreements, for monitoring, for anything that could buy these birds time. But he was working against forces larger than any individual scientist. In 2011, the Syrian civil war began, and Sarah had to leave. He fled the country, and the birds, those last few migrants, flew on without him, without anyone watching. In 2013, the last one was seen, a bird named Zenobia, making her return north to Palmyra in the spring. She arrived, she stayed for the season, and then she left for the south, and was never seen again. The migratory northern bald ibis, the version of this species that had flown between continents for 2 million years, was functionally extinct as a wild creature. Except for a biologist in Austria who had been watching all of this unfold with a particular kind of determined desperation. His name is Johannes Fritz. And Johannes Fritz had an idea that, when he first described it to his colleagues, they probably received with some polite skepticism. He wanted to teach the birds to migrate. Not metaphorically, literally. If the problem was that wild ibises had lost their migratory tradition, because migration in birds isn't entirely instinctive, it's partly learned, passed down from generation to generation like a cultural inheritance, then the solution, Fritz believed, was to replace the elders who had carried that knowledge. Replace them with something the young birds could follow. Replace them with a human being in an ultralight aircraft. He will tell you himself that the idea came from a movie, a 1996 film called Fly Away Home, in which a young girl pilots a microlight plane to guide a flock of orphaned Canada geese along a migratory route they would never have found on their own. Fritz watched that film and thought, yes, that is the thing. He started slowly, working with birds from zoos, birds that had never migrated, that had been born in captivity, and had no idea what migration even was. He raised them by hand from the time they were chicks, becoming their foster parent, their point of reference, the thing they trusted most in the world. In birds, this process is called imprinting. The young ibises didn't know they were birds, exactly. They knew they were something that followed Johannes Fritz. And then, Johannes Fritz learned to fly. He got his pilot's license. He acquired an ultralight aircraft, a tiny fragile thing with a fan-like motor on the back and a parachute keeping it aloft, looking for all the world like a lawn chair attached to a propeller. And in 2002, for the first time, he climbed into this machine with a flock of ibises flying alongside him, and he pointed south. The early attempts were messy. Weather turned on them. Technical problems grounded the aircraft mid-route, and the birds had to be transported by road. But they kept trying, year after year, refining the process, learning what the birds needed, and slowly, it started to work. By 2005, birds were not just flying to Tuscany in the autumn. They were flying back north to Austria in the spring, on their own, without the ultralight, without Fritz. They had internalized the route. Tuscany. This is where Italy enters the story in a new way, not as the place where the species went extinct centuries ago, but as the winter home of the comeback. The Waldrapp team, as Fritz's organization came to be known, chose a WWF nature reserve on the Tuscan coast, the Oasi Laguna di Orbitello, as the wintering ground for their reintroduced birds. It was chosen carefully. Good habitat, relatively protected, food available. The birds arrived, looked around, and apparently decided it was acceptable. But Italy had a problem. A serious, persistent, devastating problem that nearly killed the entire project before it could find its footing. People were shooting the birds. Not one person, not one incident. Year after year, ibises making the migration south across the Italian peninsula were being killed, poached. The birds were wearing GPS trackers. This is how the researchers knew, with terrible precision, exactly where each animal died, exactly when the signal went still. The Apennines, the Tuscan Hills, the Po Valley. The birds that survived the crossing into Africa were being lost on Italian soil, in a country that is nominally a member of the European Union and theoretically subject to wildlife protection laws. In 2012, the bird named Goya, the first ibis to fly independently to Tuscany and return north in the spring, the proof of concept that the whole project rested on. A bird that had made the journey 4 times and had even bred successfully, Goya was shot by an Italian hunter, along with one of its offspring, 2 generations gone in a single afternoon. Fritz kept records. Over the first decade of the project, roughly half of all ibises that reached Italy were killed by poachers. Half. If you are trying to rescue a species and half the animals you release are being killed in one country, you have a very specific kind of problem. What followed was a different kind of conservation work. Slower, less cinematic, more political. The Waldrapp team partnered with Italian hunting associations. They ran public awareness campaigns. They worked with GPS data not just to track the birds, but to give local authorities real-time information about where the animals were, so that intervention was at least theoretically possible. They pushed for legal enforcement. They pushed, and slowly, things began to change. The illegal hunting of ibises in Italy was cut nearly in half. Not eliminated, halved. Which, in conservation terms, when you are working with such small numbers, is the difference between a project that survives and one that collapses. And the project survived. By 2019, there were 142 northern bald ibises living wild in Europe, breeding in 3 colonies north of the Alps, wintering together in Tuscany, migrating between these 2 worlds twice a year without any help from an ultralight aircraft, a self-organized, functioning population where none had existed for 300 years. The European Union, which had funded much of this through its Life Plus biodiversity program, called it one of the most significant conservation achievements on the continent. But there was a catch. Scientists ran the models. They looked at the 142 birds, and they asked, is this enough? Is this population stable on its own? Or does it need continued human support to survive? And the answer came back uncomfortable. 142 birds was not enough. The population was viable in good years, but it couldn't absorb the shocks, a bad hunting season, a disease outbreak, a run of harsh weather without risking collapse. The minimum number for genuine self-sufficiency, according to the modeling, was somewhere north of 360. So in 2022, a second project launched. Bigger, longer, more ambitious. Covering 4 countries, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. 7 breeding colonies planned, all feeding into the same Tuscan wintering ground, a target of 360 wild birds by 2028. 60% of the budget coming from the EU, the rest from partners and donors across the continent. The daily flights now cover up to 300 kilometers. The foster parents, the scientists who raise the chicks by hand and then climb into their ultralights to lead them south, have refined the technique across 20 years of practice. They've learned which routes work best, which weather windows to aim for, how to keep the group together through mountain passes. They shout encouragement through bullhorns. They wave their arms from the cockpit. They are, in the most literal possible sense, parents. What's remarkable is that none of this was inevitable. Every step of this story had a moment where it could have ended differently. Sarah could have looked in the wrong direction in that Syrian desert. Fritz could have dismissed his own idea as too ridiculous to pursue. The EU could have pulled funding. Italian law enforcement could have continued to look the other way. Any single link in this chain breaks, and the northern bald ibis as a migratory species is simply gone. But there is something else going on here. Something that only becomes visible when you step back from the individual story and look at the broader picture. Italy, which for decades was essentially a graveyard for migratory birds, a place where hunters shot millions of birds on their way through every year, a place where conservation groups had been fighting legal battles for generations. Italy is slowly, genuinely changing. The Waldrapp project was part of that change. The scrutiny it brought, the GPS data that made every illegal kill visible and documented, the partnerships with hunting organizations that reframed the relationship between hunters and wildlife, all of this fed into something larger. In May of 2025, BirdLife International and its Italian partner Lippu announced one of the most significant updates to Italy's conservation landscape in decades. 113 new important bird and biodiversity areas identified across the country. 118 existing ones revised and expanded. The total network now covers more than 9 million hectares. It is, as BirdLife put it, a science-based foundation for Italy to meet its EU conservation targets, to restore what was lost. The stories inside that announcement are worth sitting with. Bonelli's eagle, a species that was expected, according to scientific modeling 15 years ago, to be extinct in Italy within 50 years, has been pulled back. Targeted nest protection in Sicily has grown the population to around 60 breeding pairs. The Kentish plover, a pale little shorebird that nests on beaches and loses its eggs every year to beach cleaning machinery, is now being protected by volunteers who mark the edge of dunes, install cages over nests, and stand between the birds and the machines. None of this is easy. The Lanner falcon is still in rapid decline, down to fewer than 30 breeding pairs in the entire country. The little bustard, a grassland bird found only on Sardinia within Italy, has been declining steadily for 15 years. The ortolan bunting, a bird that was once served as a delicacy in French restaurants, eaten whole under a napkin to hide the shame of it, survives in Italy with fewer than 1,000 breeding pairs, mostly concentrated now in the marsh region. The problems haven't gone away. They've just become more visible. And visibility, it turns out, is the beginning of everything. When Sarah found those 7 birds in Syria in 2002, he couldn't have known that the country would fall into civil war 9 years later. He couldn't have known that Zenobia's last flight north would be the final act of a 2-million-year story. But what he did, the tagging, the tracking, the documentation, the sheer insistence on looking when everyone else had stopped, that created a record, a data point, a before-the-after photo. And that record is now part of why the northern bald ibis still exists as a migratory species on this planet. There is a moment in the history of this project that Johannes Fritz has described as almost surreal. He is in the ultralight, a few hundred feet above the Austrian countryside, the Alps ahead of him, and on either side and just behind him, 30 young ibises are flying in formation. Their wingspan is almost a meter. Their black feathers catch the light. They are watching him, following him, trusting him with a completeness that only a creature that has imprinted on you can manage. And he is aware in that moment that he is performing something that hasn't happened in this airspace for 3 centuries. That these birds, or their descendants, might remember this route, might carry it forward in the way birds carry things forward, through demonstration and repetition and the mysterious deep grammar of migration long after he is gone. It's an almost surreal experience, he said, to be up there in the sky with these birds, experiencing them in the air, perfectly shaped for flying. It's a touching and extraordinary experience. By 2028, if the second project reaches its goals, there will be more than 360 wild northern bald ibises migrating between the Alps and Tuscany. That number will represent the calculated threshold of sustainability, the point at which the population can absorb losses, can weather bad years, can exist without a human being in an ultralight, leading the way every autumn. The birds will still winter in Italy. They will still cross the Apennines and descend toward the Tuscan coast and settle into the Oasi Laguna di Orbitello for the cold months. They will still be tracked by GPS, still be monitored, still be counted. But the hope, the actual, scientific, data-backed hope, is that they will be doing this because they know how. Because it is in them now. Because the knowledge has passed from foster parent to fledgling's offspring, and the chain is long enough and strong enough to hold. In Syria, the ruins of Palmyra still stand, damaged by the war that came after Sarah left. The cliff where 7 birds once nested is still there. The desert around it is quiet. But somewhere above Tuscany, in the blue-gray autumn air, a northern bald ibis with iridescent black feathers and a ridiculous naked red head is banking south, following a route it learned from a man in a flying lawn chair, carrying forward the ancient habit of a species that nearly ran out of time. It is not a perfect story. Conservation never is. But it is, against considerable odds, a continuing one.